Well, the first thing the Iranian side has to figure out is, can they fight alone against Israel? I mean, if it's a head-to-head confrontation, where would Iran's chances be? I think it will take some time for the Iranians to figure out exactly what their options are, what the capabilities are. Never mind if the United States or others come on Israel's side. That is going to be the primary first sort of a challenge for the Iranian officials to figure out. Look, I think Iran will not want to drag the U.S. into it. They will take what Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others have been saying on the U.S. side, which that this is a bilateral, this is a unilateral Israeli action. The U.S. was not party to it. The Iranians will, at least for now, pretend that's the case because they simply cannot afford to drag the U.S. into this at this moment, because obviously that will make life so much harder for the Iranians that's trying to figure out how they possibly can respond.
And we know that the US has tried to de-risk their position in the Middle East in the run-up to this action. But if US assets and interests are targeted by Iran, then Washington will almost certainly be dragged into a broader conflict.
Right. I mean, that's it. If Iran decides to hit at the U.S. directly, then the war will widen. And then suddenly, to your point about what happens in the region, there are thousands of American soldiers across the many bases in the region. And if they become, targets for Iranian retaliation, then we're talking a very different war. The U.S. obviously doesn't want to go there. President Trump has been very clear about that. And again, Marco Rubio just made that point again, that U.S. was not party to this. Will the Iranians believe that? Will they take that on board as they decide what they would do? Remains to be seen.
Now, we have seen this before, and there was a direct confrontation between Iran and Israel last year around October. How does this compare, Alex, in your opinion? Because this looks deeply escalatory. It's part of a sustained, longer campaign that only ends, Israel says, when Iran's existential threat, i.e. its nuclear capability, has been thoroughly neutralized. Is this a region that is on the brink of a conflict, of a war?
I have to be humble and admit that I did not anticipate that Israel would do what it did. The last we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu was that he was going to let diplomacy between U.S. and Iran run its course and then make a decision whether to attack Iran or not. And we know the next round of talks were happening was supposed to happen on Sunday. They're likely to happen now. And so the Israeli decision to go and strike Iran has come as a surprise. Therefore, who knows what Israel has in mind? Is this going to be a set of strikes that will be aimed to sort of jolt the Iranian leadership to make some concessions when it comes to negotiations with Trump? Or is this part of a protracted campaign to go for regime change in Tehran, if you will, which kind of somewhat sounded what Bibi Netanyahu was suggesting in his statement earlier?
And a regime change, Alex, would imply a ground war, would it? Is Israel prepared for that?
Well, that's a very important question. Ground war, when the two countries are divided over 1,000 miles. I mean, this is, again, to your point about making historical analogies here. Iran is far away from Israel's borders. So this is not South Lebanon. This isn't Gaza. This isn't the West Bank or even Egypt. Iran is far away. So Israel's options in terms of a long war with Iran certainly it's impossible to imagine the Israelis would have the troops to do anything like that. What Israel can do is what they're doing. They have fantastic intelligence. They have penetrated the Iranian regime. They're showing that by killing the likes of the head of the Revolutionary Guards. And obviously, they have a first-rate Air Force that can carry out the sort of strikes they did. But that's not enough to bring about the Islamic Republic. Yes. Even the best case of scenario, when you're talking about the decapitation, you talk about days and weeks, the sort of thing that Israel did last year against Hezbollah. But the problem here for Israel, and it might be something they can overcome, but it's one of scale. Iran is just that much larger. And Israel, again, we have to remind ourselves, as a country, Israel is about 80 times smaller than Iran. And its population is about 8 times fewer than Iran. So it's a lot, but maybe the Israelis have a game plan here that will surprise us all.
There is a perception, Alex, wasn't there, that Iran's military, the powerful IRGC and its allies in Yemen, Hamas, Hezbollah, were severely weakened by recent Israeli and allied action against them. Has Iran in any way regrouped, and is Iran in any position to form a retaliation and a strategy, or whether it's through a conventional capability or otherwise to strike back, or is it in a particularly enfeebled position, or is Israel wrong to write off Iran completely?
Well, look, I mean, Iran's war strategy for the last few years, at least, has been relying on a sort of combination of ballistic missiles, drones, and proxies that they had created, funded across the region from Lebanon to Yemen. But we have to remember, not all those proxies are going to jump up and fight for Iran when Iran asks them to. So there's a big question mark. For example, the Houthis of Yemen. They might come to Iran's aid. Some statements from the Houthis in Yemen suggest that's the case. But again, remains to be seen. We've seen, the Iranians themselves have put pressure on the proxies, saying, don't do anything that might make the situation worse. So to sort of summarize, the Iranian war strategy right now is in not a good place. The best they can probably do, and that is very likely to happen, is another round of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and drones, perhaps targeting Israel. But then the question is, what comes after? Are we going to see this sort of tit for tat continue in many cycles without the United States getting involved? And that is the big question for the Iranians. If the U.S. gets involved, everything changes for Iran, and they know it. And that's always going to have to, that will restrain their.
Alex, this just in from IRNA, Iran's state news agency, says Armed Forces Chief Major General Mohammad Bagheri is alive and in the war room. Now, to the point of the broader region, the risks there, is Saudi at risk? We recall the attack on Aramco's Abqaiq Quraysh facility back in September 2019, believed to be carried out by Iranian-backed Houthi movement. These Israeli strikes now take the risk to energy infrastructure in the broader Middle Eastern region to an entirely new level.
Right. Look, I think, if we want to compare to Abqaiq in 2019, Saudi Arabia, and I would argue all those other Gulf states that were hawkish on Iran back then, have been spending the last 2 years or so saying to the United States that war is not something they want to see between U.S. and Iran, or even Israel and Iran. So the Gulf states are going to hope that they can stay out of this conflict. They have spent a lot of energy, including the visit recently of the Ministry of Defense of Saudi Arabia to Tehran, saying, please keep us out of your fight. So I don't think the Iranians will be starting hitting the refineries of Saudi Arabia or any other country in the Gulf region unless they feel this is a campaign to bring the regime down. The entire political system is at stake, in which case they have nothing to lose other than throw everything they have at everyone nearby. And that's a scenario that obviously is too premature to predict will happen, but it's one that's out there.
Yes. And we have to look for any lines from the leadership in Iran as to whether this attack on them is tantamount to an act of war. Is there any diplomatic off-ramp, Alex, to this?
Yeah, look, again, I mentioned earlier there were supposed to be these talks being held, a 6th round of diplomatic talks in Muscat and Oman on Sunday. It's really unlikely to see how these talks can now happen. But, the United States, as of today, still willing to sit down and have a diplomatic conversation with Iran about its nuclear program, but also other issues, including Iran's regional posture, including its position on Israel, which in the short term is only going to harden. The animosity against Israel in the short term is going to harden. But then there's perhaps a hope that what has happened now make the Islamic Republic and its leaders sit back and for a second think, what is it about Israel that they don't like? Other than that, ideologically, they've been against it since 1979. Could they change course? Could Iran have a different policy of supporting the Palestinians other than arming the likes of Hamas and Hezbollah? So these are the types of things that, in a hopeful scenario, the leadership in Tehran might start thinking about.